When Lewis Hamilton announced his groundbreaking partnership with Dior as their first Black Formula One global ambassador, the internet exploded with criticism. Fans called him a sellout. Critics questioned his authenticity. The racing world watched as one of their biggest stars faced the worst backlash of his career. But what nobody knew was that this partnership wasn't about money or fame. Hidden beneath the controversy was a family secret spanning 4 generations and 80 years. A secret that would change everything people thought they knew about Lewis Hamilton and luxury fashion itself. Sometimes the biggest storms reveal the most beautiful truths. Lewis Hamilton pulled his cap lower over his eyes as he walked through the Monaco paddock. The morning sun cast long shadows between the white hospitality tents, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the distant sound of mechanics preparing cars. It was Thursday before the Monaco Grand Prix weekend, May 2024, and everything should have felt perfect. His phone buzzed in his pocket for the 100th time that morning. He ignored it, just like he had ignored the other 99 calls and messages. But when Marcus Chun, his manager, appeared beside him with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, Lewis knew he couldn't avoid reality any longer. "Lewis, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice tight with worry. "Right now?" "Not here," Lewis replied, nodding toward a group of photographers who had spotted them. "Your office." They walked quickly toward the McLaren hospitality area, Lewis keeping his head down. He could feel eyes following him, whispers trailing in their wake. Something had changed overnight, and everyone seemed to know what it was except him. Marcus led him into a small meeting room and closed the door. The sound of the paddock faded to a dull hum through the walls. "Okay," Lewis said, finally pulling out his phone. "Tell me how bad it is." "Don't look at social media," Marcus warned. "Please, just let me explain first." But it was too late. Lewis had already opened Twitter, and the first thing he saw made his stomach drop like a stone. The hashtag Hamilton Dior disgrace was trending worldwide with over 200,000 tweets. The comments scrolled past in a blur of anger and disappointment. Hamilton sold out to luxury fashion while preaching about equality. Hypocrite. Dior partnership shows he's forgotten where he came from. This is what happens when activism meets greed. Lewis sank into a chair, his hands shaking as he scrolled. The partnership announcement with Dior had gone live 6 hours ago while he slept. What should have been a celebration, the first Black Formula One driver to become a global ambassador for the luxury fashion house, had turned into a nightmare. "The numbers are getting worse every minute," Marcus said quietly. "It started in America around midnight their time. By dawn, it had spread to Europe. Now it's hitting Asia." Lewis kept reading. Some comments questioned his authenticity as an activist. Others accused him of choosing money over principles. The worst ones attacked his race directly, suggesting he didn't belong in luxury fashion spaces. "There are think pieces being written," Marcus continued. "The Guardian has an opinion column calling it the commercialization of Black excellence. ESPN is running a segment about athletes and brand partnerships going wrong." Lewis looked up from his phone, his brown eyes filled with pain. "They don't understand." "Then help them understand," Marcus said. "We can schedule a press conference, put out a statement." "No." Lewis's voice was firm. "Not yet." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the harbor. Monaco's yachts bobbed peacefully. In the water, their owners probably still asleep, unaware of the storm brewing in the racing world. "Marcus, do you know why I really took this partnership?" His manager frowned. "The money was good, and Dior has a strong diversity message. That's not why," Lewis interrupted. He turned back to face Marcus, and for the first time all morning, his expression softened. "My father worked 3 jobs when I was growing up to pay for my karting. One of them was cleaning a Dior boutique in London." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "You never told me that." "I never told anyone." Lewis sat back down, his phone still buzzing with notifications he refused to check. "Every night while I slept, my dad scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans in that beautiful store so I could race on weekends." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of engines being tested on the track. "When I was 7 years old, after watching my first Grand Prix at Silverstone, I made my dad a promise." Lewis's voice grew quieter. "I promised him that if I ever made it to Formula One, I would use my success to open doors for other people who looked like us." Marcus leaned forward. "Lewis, But there was more to that promise. Something I've never told anyone, not even you. Louis pulled out his wallet and removed a worn photograph. It showed a small boy and his father standing outside the Silverstone circuit gates, both soaked from rain but smiling. That day at Silverstone, when we were standing outside in the rain, because we couldn't afford tickets, my dad told me about his job at Dior. He talked about how beautiful the clothes were, how elegant the customers looked. But he also told me how they looked at him. Louis traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. He said, "Louis, if you ever become successful, I want you to promise me something else. I want you to walk into places where people like us aren't supposed to belong. I want you to show them we deserve to be there too." Marcus sat back in his chair, understanding dawning on his face. "The Dior partnership isn't about the money," Louis continued. "It's about fulfilling that promise to my 7-year-old self and my father. It's about walking through the front door of the same type of store where my dad worked nights, but this time as their partner, not their cleaner." His phone rang suddenly, making both men jump. The caller ID showed Dad. Louis answered immediately. "Hi, Dad." Anthony Hamilton's voice was warm but concerned. "Son, I've been watching the news. Are you okay?" Louis started, then stopped. How could he explain that keeping his childhood promise was costing him everything he had built? "I'm trying to be. Do you remember what you promised me when you were 7? After that day at Silverstone?" Louis closed his eyes, the memory as clear as yesterday. "I remember." "Then you know what you have to do." After Louis hung up, Marcus looked at him expectantly. "What do you want to do?" Louis stood up again, squaring his shoulders. Outside the window, the first practice session was about to begin. Cars were lining up on the grid, drivers preparing for the weekend ahead. Life in Formula One would continue, with or without him. "I want to tell the truth," Louis said. "All of it. Even the parts I've kept secret for 25 years. He picked up his phone one last time, scrolling through the angry comments and harsh criticism. Then he put it away and looked at Marcus with determination. "But first, there's someone I need to call. Someone who's been part of this story longer than anyone realizes." Marcus waited, but Louis didn't elaborate. Some secrets he had learned long ago were too important to rush. Some truths needed to be revealed at exactly the right moment. As the sound of Formula One engines roared to life outside, Lewis Hamilton prepared to share a story that would change everything people thought they knew about him, about his partnership with Dior, and about the promises that had shaped his entire life. The golden hour was shattered, but perhaps something even more beautiful could be built from the pieces. The Dior headquarters in Paris felt like walking into a freezer. Louis sat across from CEO Pietro Beccari at a long glass table that reflected the worried faces around it. Through the tall windows, he could see protesters gathering on Avenue Montaigne, their signs clearly visible even from the 15th floor. "The numbers keep getting worse," Beccari said, sliding a tablet across the table. His Italian accent was thicker when he was stressed. "Sales calls down 60% since this morning. Our customer service lines are jammed with complaints." Louis stared at the data but couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the phone call he had made after leaving Marcus. The voice that answered had been shaky with age but sharp with memory. "What are you thinking, Louis?" asked Isabella Rodriguez, Dior's head of brand partnerships. She was younger than the other executives, with kind eyes that reminded Louis of his primary school teacher. "I'm thinking about a promise I made when I was 7, Louis said quietly. The room went silent. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder. Hamilton equals sell out, and Dior equals fake diversity. Louis could see news vans arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Paris sky. Marcus paced by the window, his phone buzzing constantly. "We have interview requests from every major network. BBC, CNN, Sky Sports. They all want a response. We could end the partnership," suggested Jean-Paul Laurent, Dior's chief marketing officer. His voice was careful, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping baby. "Issue a joint statement about different visions for the future." "No." Louis's voice cut through the room like a knife. "That's exactly what they want us to do." Isabella leaned forward. "Louis, we believe in this partnership. We really do. But our board meets in 1 hour, and they're scared. Social media can destroy brands in days now." Louis stood up and walked to the window. Below, the crowd was growing bigger. He could see reporters setting up cameras, preparing for live broadcasts. This wasn't just about a fashion deal anymore. This was about who belonged where and why. His phone rang. The screen showed Dad again. "I need to take this," Louis said, stepping into the hallway. "Louis." Anthony Hamilton's voice sounded tired. "Hi, Dad. I'm in Paris at Dior headquarters. It's really bad. Son, I've been watching the news all morning. I've been thinking about that day at Silverstone when you made me that promise." Louis closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. The memory was so clear he could smell the rain and hear the roar of the engines beyond the fence. "I remember every word," Louis whispered. "Do you remember what else happened that day? After we got home?" Louis frowned. "We dried off and had fish and chips for dinner. Before that," Anthony said gently, "do you remember what I showed you in my wallet?" Louis's breath caught. He had forgotten about that part, buried under years of racing and victories and championships. But now it came flooding back. "You showed me a business card," Louis said slowly. "That's right. A business card from Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the night manager at the Dior store where I worked. She had given it to me that week." "Why?" Anthony was quiet for a long moment. "She said if you ever made it as a race car driver, I should call her. She said she had an idea about how to help young people like you get better opportunities." Louis felt his heart racing. "Dad, did you ever call her?" "No, son. I lost the card when we moved house the next year." "But Louis, I looked her up online this morning. She still lives near London. She's 86 years old now, but she's still alive." Louis slid down the wall until he was sitting on the hallway floor. "Do you have her number?" "I found her address. She doesn't use phones much anymore. But there's something else." Anthony's voice grew excited. "I found an old newspaper article from 2007. Mrs. Pemberton was quoted talking about diversity in luxury fashion. She mentioned a young race car driver she had once hoped to help. She was talking about me. Louis, I think she's been following your career this whole time. I think she's been waiting for this moment." Louis stood up quickly, his mind racing. Through the glass doors, he could see the Dior executives still sitting around the conference table, their faces grave with worry. "Dad, I need to go to London tonight." "Are you sure? The media will follow you everywhere." "I have to take that chance," Louis said. "Mrs. Pemberton might be the key to understanding why this partnership matters so much. She might be the person who can help me explain it to the world." Louis walked back into the conference room. All eyes turned to him, waiting for his decision. "I'm not ending the partnership," he announced. "But I am going to London tonight to meet someone who's been part of this story longer than any of us realized." Pietro Beccari frowned. "Louis, that sounds risky. The media is already calling me a sellout and a fake activist," Louis interrupted. "But what if they're wrong? What if this partnership was meant to happen? What if someone saw it coming 17 years ago?" Isabella looked confused. "What do you mean?" Louis picked up his phone and showed them the photo of himself and his father at Silverstone. "This picture was taken the day I promised my dad I would use racing to help other people like us. But it was also the day I learned about Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton." He paused, looking around the room at the worried faces. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to have tea with an 86-year-old woman who worked for Dior when I was 7 years old. And I think she's going to tell me something that will change how everyone sees this partnership." Marcus stopped pacing. "Louis, what if you're wrong? What if this makes everything worse?" Louis smiled for the first time all day. "Then at least we'll know we tried to tell the truth instead of running from it." Outside, the protesters kept chanting, but Louis wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about promises made by 7-year-old boys, about business cards lost and found, and about an old woman who might hold the key to everything. The McLaren Technology Center in Woking felt like a safe haven after the chaos in Paris. Louis sat in the familiar conference room where he had celebrated victories and planned race strategies for years. But today, the people around the table weren't talking about lap times or tire choices. Angela Cullen had flown in from New Zealand. When she heard the news, even though she no longer worked with Louis full-time, she was still like a big sister to him. Her eyes were full of worry as she studied his tired face. "The media is calling it the biggest disaster in Formula One history," said Sarah Mitchell, Louis's communications director. She clicked through news headlines on the big screen. "Hamilton's luxury mistake. When sports stars sell out. The fall of a racing hero." Louis barely looked at the screen. His fingers played with the edges of a worn photograph he had pulled from his wallet. It was the same picture from Silverstone, him and his father in the rain, both smiling despite being soaked. "Tell us about the promise," Angela said gently. She could always read Louis's moods better than anyone. Louis took a deep breath. "When I was 7, my dad took me to my first Grand Prix. It was the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in 1992. We couldn't afford tickets, so we stood outside the fence in the pouring rain." He looked up at his team, these people who had become like family over the years. "I told my dad I wanted to race cars like that someday. He knelt down in the mud and made me promise him something. He said, 'Louis, if you ever make it to Formula One, you have to promise me you'll never forget where you came from. Promise me you'll use your success to open doors for other people who look like us.'" The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. But there was more. Louis continued, his voice getting softer. "Something I've never told anyone before today." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "What was it?" Louis looked at the photograph again, remembering that rainy day so clearly. "My dad worked 3 jobs to pay for my karting. One of them was cleaning a Dior store in London at night. He used to tell me stories about the beautiful clothes and the rich customers who came in during the day." Angela's eyes went wide as she began to understand. "The customers treated him like he was invisible," Louis said, "like he was just part of the furniture. They never said hello or thank you. They acted like he didn't matter." Louis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the English countryside. "That day at Silverstone, when I made my promise about opening doors, my dad said something else. He said, 'Someday, Louis, when you're successful, I want you to walk into places where people like us aren't welcome. I want you to show them we belong there too.'" He turned back to face the room. "The Dior partnership isn't about money or fame. It's about my dad. It's about every person who was ever made to feel like they didn't belong." Sarah was taking notes. Quickly, "Louis, this changes everything. If people knew this story, they will know." Louis interrupted. "Tomorrow I'm going to meet Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the woman who managed the store where my dad worked. She gave him a business card 17 years ago, but we lost it when we moved house." Marcus, who had been quiet until now, looked up from his phone. "I've been researching her online. Mrs. Pemberton worked for Dior for over 40 years. She retired as a senior manager in 2010. What else did you find?" Angela asked. "She's been giving interviews about diversity in fashion since she retired. In 2018, she told Vogue magazine that luxury brands needed to do more than just hire diverse models. She said they needed to support diverse talent from the ground up." Louis felt a chill run down his spine. "She's been thinking about this for years." "There's more," Marcus continued. "I found a quote from her in Harper's Bazaar last year. She said, 'I once knew a young boy whose father cleaned our floors so he could chase his dreams. I always wondered what would happen if the fashion world supported dreamers like him instead of ignoring them.'" The room fell completely silent. Everyone was staring at Marcus. "She was talking about me." Louis whispered that Sarah's phone started buzzing with calls from reporters, but she ignored it. "Louis, if Mrs. Pemberton has been following your career all these years, if she planned for this moment, then the partnership isn't just about breaking barriers now," Angela finished. "It's about healing something that was broken a long time ago." Louis sat back down, feeling overwhelmed. "My whole life, I thought we did everything alone. Dad working those jobs, me fighting my way through karting and Formula One. I thought it was just us against the world." "Maybe it wasn't," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe there were people watching and hoping and waiting for the right time to help." Louis picked up his phone and scrolled through some of the angry comments from social media. They still hurt, but they felt different now. Less like attacks on who he was and more like misunderstandings about who he had always been. "I need to call Mrs. Pemberton," Louis said. "I need to arrange this meeting." Angela nodded. "Do you want us to come with you?" "No," Louis replied. "This is something I need to do alone. Just me and the promise I made to a 7-year-old boy standing in the rain." He looked around the room at the people who had supported him through championships and challenges. "But I will need all of you afterward. Because once Mrs. Pemberton tells me what she knows, I have a feeling this story is going to get much bigger." Sarah was already typing on her laptop. "I'll prepare for a major press conference. Something tells me you're going to have a lot to say." As his team got back to work, Louis stayed by the window, watching the sun set over the Woking countryside. Somewhere in London, an 86-year-old woman was probably preparing for tea tomorrow. A woman who might hold the answers to questions Lewis didn't even know he should ask. The weight of his childhood promise felt heavier than ever, but also more purposeful. Tomorrow, he would learn if the little boy who stood in the rain at Silverstone had been part of a bigger plan all along. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Mrs. Pemberton is expecting you at 3 p.m. tomorrow. She says she has been waiting 17 years for this conversation." Lewis smiled for the first time in 2 days. Maybe the storm wasn't just about destroying what he had built. Maybe it was about clearing the way for something even better to grow, the Silverstone circuit. Media Center had never been so packed. Journalists from around the world filled every seat, with camera crews lined up against the walls. The British Grand Prix was still 3 weeks away, but this couldn't wait. Lewis sat at the familiar table where he had celebrated wins and explained defeats for years. But today his hands shook slightly as he reached for his water bottle. The room buzzed with whispers and the clicking of cameras. "I want to talk about the Dior partnership," Lewis began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But first, I need to tell you a story I've never shared before." The room went completely quiet. In the back, he spotted Natasha Kaplinsky from BBC News, leaning forward with interest. 25 years ago, my father made a choice that changed my life forever. He worked as a night cleaner at a Dior store in London. Every night while I slept, he mopped floors and emptied bins so I could race go-karts on weekends. A few reporters looked surprised. This wasn't in any of Lewis's official biographies. One night when I was 8, I couldn't sleep. I followed my dad to work and hid outside the store. I watched him through the window, cleaning that beautiful shop. I saw how the security guards looked at him. I saw how the manager spoke to him. Lewis paused, remembering that cold night so clearly. That's when I realized my dad wasn't just working to pay for my racing. He was working in a place that saw him as invisible, just another cleaner who didn't matter. The silence in the room was complete. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures. When I signed with Dior last week, I wasn't thinking about money or fame. I was thinking about that 8-year-old boy watching his father through a window. I was thinking about the promise I made to myself that night. Rachel Brooks from Sky Sports raised her hand. "Lewis, what was the promise?" Lewis looked directly at her. "That someday, I would walk through the front door of that store. Not as the cleaner's son, but as their partner. That I would show the world people like my father and me don't just belong in the back room cleaning up. We belong at the front, being celebrated." The questions came fast after that. But Lewis had found his rhythm. This wasn't about defending himself anymore. This was about honoring his father and everyone who had been overlooked. "Some people say you're selling out," called out a reporter from The Guardian. "How do you answer that?" "I say I'm buying in," Lewis replied. "I'm buying into spaces that weren't made for us and making them ours too." In the audience, Daniel Thompson from The Guardian stood up. He was young and black, maybe 25 years old. "Lewis, critics say luxury partnerships are just fake activism. What makes this different?" Lewis studied the young man's face. "Daniel, can I ask you something? What did your father do for work?" Daniel looked surprised but answered, "He drove buses in Birmingham." "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong in certain places because of where you came from?" Daniel nodded. Slowly. "All the time." "Then you understand why this matters. This isn't fake activism. This is real life. It's saying that talent and worth come from everywhere, not just from fancy schools and rich families." More hands shot up around the room. Lewis could feel the mood shifting. The hostile questions were becoming curious ones. "My father worked 3 jobs when I was growing up," Lewis continued. "Construction during the day, IT support in the evenings, and cleaning the Dior store at night. He never complained, never said it was unfair. But I saw what it cost him." Lewis's voice grew stronger. "Every trophy I've won, every championship I've celebrated, they all started with my dad scrubbing floors so I could chase my dreams. When Dior asked me to partner with them, I thought about him walking through those same doors he used to clean. But this time, as the father of their global ambassador." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "What would you say to people who think you've forgotten your roots?" Lewis smiled sadly. "I'd say my roots are exactly why I'm here. Everything I do is connected to where I came from. The difference is, now I have the power to change things for the next kid whose parent works 3 jobs to chase a dream." James Allen, the respected motorsport journalist, stood up. "Lewis, there's clearly more to this story. What aren't you telling us?" Louis looked around the room at the faces watching him. Some skeptical, some supportive, all waiting for his answer. You're right, James. There is more. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with someone who's been part of this story longer than anyone realizes. Someone who worked at that same Dior store when my father was there. The room erupted with new questions, but Louis held up his hand. Eleanor Pemberton managed the store where my dad worked. She gave him a business card 17 years ago, saying if I ever made it as a racing driver, he should call her. We lost the card, but yesterday we found her again. Louis stood up, feeling lighter than he had in days. Mrs. Pemberton has been following my career for years. She's been waiting for this moment. And tomorrow, I think she's going to tell me something that will change how everyone sees this partnership. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed out to file their stories, Louis felt something shift inside him. The anger and hurt from the past few days was transforming into something else. Purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. Watch the press conference. I'm proud of you, son. Mrs. Pemberton called. She said tomorrow's meeting will be the most important conversation of your life. Louis walked out of the media center into the afternoon sunlight. Tomorrow he would sit down for tea with an 86-year-old woman who might hold the key to everything. A woman who had been quietly watching and waiting for nearly 2 decades. The storm was still raging in the media and on social platforms. But Louis no longer felt like he was fighting it alone. Somewhere in the chaos, allies were emerging. People who understood that sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest acts of courage, like a 7-year-old boy making a promise in the rain, or an old woman keeping a business card for 17 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. The call came at 2 a.m. London time. Louis was in his Monaco apartment, staring at the ceiling and unable to sleep, when his phone lit up with an unknown number. He almost let it ring, but something made him answer. Is this Lewis Hamilton? The voice was old and shaky, with a French accent that sounded elegant even through the phone's static. Yes, who is this? My name is Marie-Claire Dubois. I am 83 years old, and I live in Marseille. I have something important to tell you about your Dior partnership. Louis sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. How did you get this number? That doesn't matter right now. What matters is what I saw in 1943, during the war, when I was a young girl working for Christian Dior himself. The connection crackled, but Louis was listening intently now. Madam, it's very late, and I'm not sure what. During the war, Monsieur Dior secretly gave jobs to people the Nazis said couldn't work. Jewish seamstresses who were hiding, Roma people who cut fabric, even Black American soldiers who had run away from the army because of how badly they were treated. Louis felt his heart beating faster. Why are you telling me this? Because I have been watching the news about you and Dior. The mean things people are saying remind me of what happened back then. People said those workers didn't belong in our beautiful shop. They said luxury fashion wasn't for their kind. The old woman's voice grew stronger. But Monsieur Dior believed that beauty belonged to everyone. He died before he could see his dream come true. Your partnership with Dior, this is what he would have wanted. Louis found himself pacing around his apartment in the dark. Madame Dubois, would you talk to reporters about this? There was a long silence. I am dying, Monsieur Hamilton. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. But yes, if it helps you, I will tell the world what I know. 2 days later, Marie-Claire Dubois sat in a wheelchair before a room full of reporters at the Christian Dior Museum in Granville, France. Louis sat beside her, holding her thin hand as she spoke into the microphone. I want everyone to know that Christian Dior was a man who cared about all people, she said, her voice clear despite her age. He believed fashion should make people feel beautiful, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. She reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a yellowed photograph. This is Henri Beaumont. He was a Black American jazz musician who worked cutting fabric for Dior in 1944. The Nazis would have killed him if they found him, but Monsieur Dior kept him safe. The photograph showed a handsome Black man in his 30s, working alongside white women at sewing machines. Everyone in the picture was smiling. Henri used to tell me that working in the fashion house felt like freedom, Marie-Claire continued. In that room, he wasn't a runaway soldier or someone people looked down on. He was an artist making beautiful things. Louis squeezed her hand gently. He could see the reporters taking notes quickly, understanding how important this story was. When I see people attacking Monsieur Hamilton on the internet, I think of Henri. I think of all the talented people who were told they didn't belong. Fashion isn't about where your family comes from. It's about where your dreams can take you. The story spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, hashtag Dior history was trending alongside the negative hashtags about Louis. People began sharing old photos and stories about hidden diversity in fashion history. Stories that had been buried for decades were finally coming to light. Back in London, Louis sat with his father in their old kitchen, reading the news coverage together. "Look at this," Anthony said, showing Louis his phone. A woman in New York found pictures of her grandmother, who worked as a seamstress for a luxury brand in the 1950s. She never knew because her family was told to keep it secret. Louis scrolled through more posts. Here's a man whose father designed buttons for high-end clothing companies, but was never given credit because of his race. "Your partnership isn't just about you anymore," Anthony said quietly. "It's helping people find their hidden history." Louis's phone rang. It was Marcus, calling from Paris. "Louis, you need to see this." Bernard Arnault himself just posted a statement on the Dior website. Louis put the phone on speaker so his father could hear. He's announcing that Dior is starting a new program, the Heritage Heroes Foundation. They're going to research and honor all the diverse workers who contributed to luxury fashion history but were never recognized. Anthony's eyes filled with tears. All those people who were made to feel invisible, finally being seen. "There's more," Marcus continued. "They want you to be the spokesperson for the foundation. They're offering to fund research into hidden fashion history in 10 different countries." Louis looked at his father, thinking about the promise he had made as a 7-year-old boy. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. "What about Eleanor Pemberton?" Louis asked. "I'm still supposed to meet her tomorrow." "Actually," Marcus said, "she called this morning. She wants to move the meeting to the Dior store in London, the same store where your father worked." Louis felt chills run down his arms. "The same store?" She said, "It's time for you to walk through the front door." That evening, Louis sat on his balcony looking out at the Mediterranean Sea. The storm that had started 3 days ago was still raging in some corners of the internet, but something had changed. The story was no longer just about him and Dior. It had become about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. His phone buzzed with a message from Marie-Claire Dubois. "Thank you for giving me the chance to honor Henry's memory. He would be so proud to see a young man like you opening doors he could only dream of." Louis typed back, "Thank you for showing me I'm not alone in this fight." As the sun set over Monaco, Louis thought about tomorrow's meeting with Eleanor Pemberton. A meeting that would take place in the very store where his father had once worked nights, cleaning floors and dreaming of a better future for his son. Soon, Louis would learn that some connections run deeper than anyone could imagine. That some stories are connected across decades in ways that seem almost impossible to believe. The business card Eleanor Pemberton had given his father 17 years ago hadn't been lost by accident. It had been waiting for exactly the right moment to be found again. The Ferrari garage at the Hungarian Grand Prix buzzed with activity, but all eyes were on the McLaren hospitality suite across the paddock. Louis had done something unusual. He had asked all 20 Formula One drivers to meet with him privately. In 15 years of racing, nothing like this had ever happened. Max Verstappen arrived first, still wearing his Red Bull racing suit. Charles Leclerc followed, then Lando Norris. Soon, drivers from every team filled the small conference room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Thanks for coming," Louis began, looking around at the faces he had raced against for years. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. "I know this is strange, but I need to talk to all of you about something bigger than racing." George Russell, his former Mercedes teammate, shifted in his seat. "Louis, mate, this whole Dior situation has gotten pretty intense." "That's exactly why I wanted to speak to everyone," Louis replied. "Because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us." Sebastian Vettel, recently retired but still respected by everyone, leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Louis took a deep breath. "How many of you remember your first day in a Formula One paddock? That feeling of being out of place, like you didn't belong?" Several drivers nodded. Fernando Alonso spoke up. "I was terrified at my first race. I felt like everyone was judging me, waiting for me to make a mistake." "Exactly," Louis said. Now imagine feeling that way not just because you're new, but because of how you look. Because people question whether someone like you has any right to be here. The room went quiet. Pierre Gasly looked down at his hands. Louis, we all respect what you've achieved, Pierre started. This isn't about respect, Louis interrupted gently. It's about understanding. When I partner with Dior, I'm not just representing myself. I'm representing every kid who looks like me and dreams of being in places where they've never seen anyone like themselves. Yuki Tsunoda, the Japanese driver, spoke up unexpectedly. I understand this feeling. When I first came to Europe to race, people would stare at me in restaurants, like I was some kind of curiosity that didn't belong there. Yes, Louis said, his eyes lighting up. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The Dior partnership is about changing that feeling for the next generation. Daniel Ricciardo, usually the joker of the group, was surprisingly serious. But Louis, some of the criticism is about the money side of things. People think you're just cashing in on your fame. Louis smiled sadly. If I wanted to cash in, I would have signed with a sports brand years ago for twice the money. Dior represents something different. It represents breaking into spaces that were never designed for people like me. Carlos Sainz Jr. raised his hand, like he was back in school. But why is this so personal for you? There has to be more to the story. Louis looked around the room at these young men he had competed against, argued with, and grown to respect over the years. They deserve to know at least part of the truth. My father cleaned a Dior store to pay for my karting career, Louis said simply. Every night for 3 years, he scrubbed their floors so I could race on weekends. When I signed with Dior, I thought about him walking through those same doors he used to clean. But this time, as the father of their global partner, the silence was complete. These men understood sacrifice and family dedication better than most people. Lando Norris, the youngest driver in the room, spoke first. That's actually beautiful, Louis. One by one, the drivers began sharing their own stories. About families who worked multiple jobs to support their racing dreams. About feeling like outsiders when they first entered the wealthy world of motorsport. About times when they had been judged for their accents, their backgrounds, or their appearances. My father sold his car to buy my first go-kart, said Esteban Ocon. I know what it feels like to not fit in with the rich kids at racing schools. People in Italy used to ask me if I was really Italian because of my name, added Charles Leclerc. They wanted to know where my family originally came from. As the conversation continued, Louis felt something shifting in the room. What had started as him defending his choices had become something deeper. A recognition that they were all more similar than different. I have an idea, said Oscar Piastri, the young Australian driver. What if we made a statement together? All of us supporting the idea that Formula One should be a sport that welcomes everyone. Max Verstappen, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke. Louis, I may not understand everything you've been through, but I respect what you're trying to do. If you need support from the drivers, you have it. One by one, the others nodded in agreement. Even Pierre Gasly, who had looked uncomfortable earlier, stood up. We race against each other on the track, Pierre said. But off the track, we should stand together for what's right. As the meeting ended and drivers began heading back to their garages for practice sessions, Louis felt something he hadn't experienced in days. Hope. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Pemberton. I saw the news about your fellow drivers supporting you. It reminds me of something that happened in 1958 at the Dior store. Tomorrow, when we meet, I'll tell you about the day your father's story really began. Long before he started working for us. Louis stared at the message, confused. His father's story began before he worked at Dior? What could that mean? As he walked back toward his own garage, Louis realized that tomorrow's meeting would reveal more than just old connections. It would uncover secrets that had been carefully kept for decades. Secrets that would explain why some things that seem like coincidences are actually destiny waiting for the right moment to unfold. The tide was finally turning in his favor, but Louis sensed the biggest revelations were still to come. The Dior boutique on New Bond Street looked exactly the same as Louis remembered from his childhood. The gleaming windows, the elegant displays, the doorman in his crisp uniform. But today, for the first time in his life, Lewis Hamilton was walking through the front entrance as an invited guest. Eleanor Pemberton stood waiting inside, leaning on a walking stick but still carrying herself. with the grace of someone who had spent decades in luxury retail. At 86, her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a vintage Dior jacket that looked like it had been made just for her. "Louis," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I've been waiting 17 years to have this conversation. Properly." The store manager, a young woman named Sophie, led them to a private room upstairs that overlooked the busy London street. Tea was already prepared on a delicate china service that Louis suspected was worth more than most people's cars. "Before we begin," Eleanor said, settling into her chair, "I want you to know that everything I'm about to tell you is true. I have documents, photographs, and witnesses to prove it all." Louis felt his heart racing. "Mrs. Pemberton, what exactly happened 17 years ago?" Eleanor smiled and opened an old leather briefcase. "That's not where our story begins, dear boy. Our story starts in 1958, when I was a young shop assistant and your grandfather came looking for work." Louis nearly dropped his teacup. "My grandfather? But he died before I was born." "Robert Hamilton was a talented man," Eleanor continued, pulling out a faded photograph. "He came to London from Jamaica in 1957, looking for opportunities. He was a skilled tailor who had learned his craft in Kingston." She handed Louis the photograph. It showed a handsome black man in his 30s, wearing a well-fitted suit, standing outside the Dior store with a group of white employees. "That's your grandfather, third from the left." Louis stared at the picture, seeing traces of his father's face in the man's features. "He worked at Dior?" "Not just worked," Eleanor said proudly. "Robert Hamilton was one of the most talented tailors we ever employed. He created patterns and techniques that we used for years. But because of the attitudes of the time, his contributions were never publicly acknowledged." Louis felt the world shifting around him. "My father never told me this." "Your father didn't know the full story," Eleanor explained gently. "Robert died when Anthony was only 12. He only knew his father had worked in fashion, but not the details." Eleanor pulled out more documents, employment records, salary receipts, even newspaper clippings from fashion shows in the late 1950s. "Your grandfather helped design pieces for some of our most famous collections. When he died suddenly in 1962, the company quietly kept using his techniques but never credited him." Louis's hands were shaking as he looked through the papers. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because when your father started working at our store in 2005, I recognized the name Hamilton immediately. I did some research and discovered he was Robert's son." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where shoppers hurried past. "I had been feeling guilty for decades about how the company had treated your grandfather. Here was my chance to do something right for his family." "The business card," Louis said quietly. "The one you gave my father. I had been watching your racing career from the beginning," Eleanor admitted. "Every time Anthony talked about you at work, every newspaper article he showed me, every photograph in his wallet, I knew you were special." She returned to her chair and pulled out one final document. "When you won your first championship in 2008, I went to the board of directors with a proposal. I wanted Dior to sponsor young, diverse talent in various fields. I used you as an example." Louis read the document, his eyes widening. It was a formal proposal dated December 2008, titled the Robert Hamilton Memorial Fund for Young Diverse Talent. "They rejected it," Eleanor said sadly. "They said the company wasn't ready for that kind of program. Too risky, they claimed. But you didn't give up. I spent the next 15 years building support within the company. Every promotion, every new hire, every board meeting. I kept pushing for diversity and inclusion. I kept talking about talented people like your grandfather whose contributions had been ignored." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. "When Bernard Arnault took full control of the company in 2017, he was much more open to these ideas. I finally had a chance to make things right." Louis felt overwhelmed by the revelation. "You've been planning this partnership for years." "Not planning exactly," Eleanor said. "Hoping, preparing, making sure that when the opportunity came, we would be ready to honor your grandfather's legacy properly." She reached into her briefcase one last time and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "This belonged to your grandfather. The company kept it in storage all these years. I think it's time it came home." Louis unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a worn leather notebook filled with sketches and measurements in his grandfather's handwriting. The pages showed designs for jackets, dresses, and accessories, some of which Louis recognized from fashion history books. He was brilliant, Eleanor said softly. Creative, innovative, ahead of his time. If he had been white, his name would be remembered alongside the great fashion designers of the 1950s. Louis closed the notebook, tears in his eyes. My father has no idea about any of this. I was hoping you might tell him, Eleanor said, along with the rest of the world. This partnership isn't just about you breaking barriers, Louis. It's about finally giving credit where credit has been due for 65 years. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor had one more surprise. There's a memorial plaque being installed downstairs next week. It will honor all the diverse workers who contributed to Dior's success but were never recognized. Your grandfather's name will be at the top of the list. Walking back down to the main floor, Louis saw the Dior boutique with completely different eyes. This wasn't just the place where his father had worked nights to support his racing dreams. It was where his grandfather had poured his creativity and skill into beautiful creations, only to be forgotten by history. But now, finally, the Hamilton family's contributions would be remembered and celebrated. The promise Louis had made as a 7-year-old boy had led to something bigger than he had ever imagined. As they stood at the front entrance, Eleanor squeezed his hand. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Louis. You've brought our family's story full circle. Louis looked back at the store one last time, then at the notebook in his hands. Tomorrow, he would share this story with the world. But tonight, he had to call his father and tell him about the grandfather he had never really known. The biggest revelation was still waiting to be discovered. The drive to Eleanor Pemberton's cottage in Surrey felt like traveling through time. Louis gripped the steering wheel of his simple Honda Civic, his grandfather's notebook on the passenger seat beside him. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with calls from reporters, but he ignored them all. This conversation was too important. For distractions, that Eleanor's cottage looked like something from a fairy tale, with climbing roses covering the walls and a wooden gate that creaked when Louis pushed it open. She was waiting at the front door, wearing a cardigan that he now recognized as vintage Dior. Come in, dear, she said warmly. I have Earl Grey brewing, and there's much more to discuss. Her sitting room was filled with antique furniture and photographs spanning decades of fashion history. But Louis was surprised to see something else on the mantelpiece. A framed photo of him crossing the finish line at his first Grand Prix victory in Canada, 2007. You kept a picture of me? He asked, touched by the gesture. My dear boy, I have every magazine cover, every race report, every interview you've ever given, Eleanor said, pouring tea from delicate china cups. When I discovered you were Robert's grandson, following your career became my personal mission. She settled into her favorite armchair with the grace of someone who had spent decades in high society. But there's something else I need to tell you. Something that will change how you see everything. Louis felt his stomach tighten. After yesterday's revelations about his grandfather, he wasn't sure he could handle any more surprises. Yesterday, I showed you documents about your grandfather's work at Dior, Eleanor continued. But I didn't tell you about the phone call I received 3 days ago. She stood up and walked to an antique writing desk, returning with a folder marked confidential in red letters. When the controversy about your partnership began, I didn't just call Bernard Arnault to support you. I called him because I had information that could change everything. Louis set down his teacup, his hands trembling slightly. What kind of information? Eleanor opened the folder and pulled out several documents and photographs. I told Bernard about your grandfather's hidden contributions to Dior, about how I had been quietly supporting your career for years. But then I shared something else. Something I had discovered just last month while organizing my late husband's papers. She handed Louis a black and white photograph that looked like it was taken in the 1940s. It showed a young white woman and an older black man standing together outside what appeared to be a tailor shop. This is my grandmother, Margaret Pemberton, and this is Samuel Roberts, Eleanor said quietly. They worked together in London during World War II, creating uniforms for British soldiers. Louis studied the photograph, confused about why this mattered. Samuel Roberts was your great-grandfather, Louis. Robert Hamilton's father. The teacup slipped from Louis's hands, shattering on the hardwood floor. What did you say? Eleanor knelt down to clean up the pieces, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. My family and your family have been connected. For over 80 years. We just never knew it. Louis felt the room spinning around him. How is that possible? During the war, my grandmother ran a small tailoring business that made military uniforms. Samuel Roberts was one of her most skilled workers, a master tailor who had come to London from Jamaica in 1940. Eleanor returned to her chair with fresh tea, giving Louis time to process what he was hearing. They became close friends, despite the racial prejudices of the time. When the war ended, Samuel decided to stay in London. My grandmother helped him start his own small tailoring business. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Samuel Roberts teaching a young man to sew. That's your grandfather Robert as a teenager, learning the craft from his father. Louis stared at the image, seeing the family resemblance across generations. My grandfather learned tailoring from my great-grandfather, who learned from your grandmother. Not just learned, Eleanor said with pride in her voice. Your great-grandfather was brilliant. Some of the techniques he developed during the war were revolutionary. My grandmother made sure those techniques were passed down. Eleanor walked to a locked drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal. This belonged to my grandmother. She wrote about Samuel Roberts frequently. Listen to this entry from 1943. She opened to a marked page and began reading. Samuel has a gift that goes beyond simple tailoring. He understands how clothing can make a person feel powerful, confident, worthy. He says that when someone puts on something beautiful that fits perfectly, they stand taller and believe in themselves more. This is the true magic of fashion. Louis felt chills running down his arms. Those words could have been spoken by him during any interview about why fashion and style mattered. There's more, Eleanor continued, turning pages in the journal. Here's an entry from 1944. Samuel spoke today about his dreams for his son, Robert. He wants the boy to work with the finest fashion houses in London someday. He believes that people like them belong in those elegant spaces, creating beauty alongside anyone else. The parallel to Louis's own childhood dreams was unmistakable. Eleanor closed the journal and looked directly at Louis. When Robert Hamilton came to work at Dior in 1958, it wasn't random. He was fulfilling his father's dream. And when you signed your partnership with Dior last week, you were continuing a family legacy that goes back 80 years. Louis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the English countryside. Everything he thought he knew about his family's story was shifting. Mrs. Pemberton, Eleanor, why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Because I wanted you to understand your grandfather's contributions first. I wanted you to feel proud of what your family had already achieved before I showed you how deep the connections really go. She joined him at the window. But there's one more thing, Louis. The most important thing of all. Louis turned to face her, not sure he could handle another revelation. The business card I gave your father 17 years ago, the one that got lost and then mysteriously found again last week. Louis nodded. Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been keeping a beautiful secret for far too long. I never stopped tracking your family. I knew exactly where that business card was the entire time. Louis's eyes widened. You mean? I mean that Bernard Arnault and I have been planning this partnership for 3 years. Ever since you started speaking out more about social justice and diversity. We've been waiting for the right moment to honor your family's legacy and heal the wounds of the past. Eleanor returned to her desk and pulled out one final document. A contract signed by Bernard Arnault and dated 6 months earlier. The Dior partnership wasn't offered to you because you're a successful racing driver, Louis. It was offered to you because you're Samuel Roberts' great-grandson, Robert Hamilton's grandson, and Anthony Hamilton's son. You represent 4 generations of excellence that was hidden from history. Louis sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. The whole controversy, the backlash, people saying I don't belong in luxury fashion. They have no idea that your family helped create the foundation that luxury fashion was built on. Eleanor finished. Tomorrow, when we announce this at the press conference, the world will understand that you're not breaking into spaces where you don't belong. You're returning to spaces your family helped build. As the afternoon sun streamed through the cottage windows, Louis realized that the promise he had made as a 7-year-old boy was about to be fulfilled in ways he never could have imagined. The Dior Atelier in Paris had never hosted a press conference before. The sacred space where Christian Dior himself had once created his revolutionary designs was usually reserved for seamstresses, designers, and the occasional private tour. But today was different. Today, the world would learn a truth that had been hidden for 80 years. Louis stood in the center of the historic room, surrounded by dress forms displaying iconic Dior creations from across the decades. Beside him stood Eleanor Pemberton, elegant in a navy blue suit she had sewn herself 50 years earlier. Bernard Arnault, one of the world's most powerful fashion executives, stood at Louis's other side. The room was packed with journalists from every major news outlet. Camera crews from CNN, BBC, French television, and fashion media filled every available space. The story that had begun as controversy about a sports partnership was about to become something much deeper. "Thank you all for coming," Louis began, his voice steady and clear. "For the past week, there has been intense debate about my partnership with Dior. Today, I want to share the complete story, not just about this partnership, but about the family connections that made it inevitable." He gestured toward Eleanor, who stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had finally decided to reveal decades of carefully guarded secrets. "This is Eleanor Pemberton. Many of you know her as a former Dior executive who has been advocating for diversity in fashion for years. But what you don't know is that her family and mine have been connected for over 80 years. Eleanor took the microphone with practiced ease. "During World War II, my grandmother Margaret ran a small tailoring business in London. One of her most talented workers was Samuel Roberts, Lewis Hamilton's great-grandfather." The room fell completely silent. Even the photographers had stopped clicking their cameras. "Samuel was a master tailor who had come to London from Jamaica in 1940, Eleanor continued. "He and my grandmother worked together creating uniforms for British soldiers. But more than that, they developed innovative techniques that would influence fashion for decades to come." She paused, letting this information sink in before continuing. "When the war ended, my grandmother helped Samuel start his own business. He passed his skills to his son Robert, who later became one of Dior's most talented tailors in the 1950s. Robert's contributions were significant, but like many diverse workers of that era, he was never given proper credit." Bernard Arnault stepped forward. "What Eleanor is describing represents a pattern we've discovered throughout our company's history. Talented workers from diverse backgrounds made important contributions that were overlooked or forgotten because of the social attitudes of their time." Louis felt his heart pounding as Bernard continued. "When we began researching this partnership with Louis, we uncovered evidence of dozens of diverse workers who helped build what we now recognize as luxury fashion. Their stories were buried in old employment records, forgotten in storage rooms, never celebrated in our official histories." Eleanor moved to a covered easel at the front of the room. "Which brings us to today's announcement." She pulled away the cloth to reveal an architectural rendering of a stunning building with glass walls and elegant gardens. "The Samuel Roberts Institute for Fashion Heritage," Eleanor announced, "to be built in London with satellite locations in Paris, New York, and Kingston, Jamaica. A permanent education and research center dedicated to uncovering and celebrating the diverse voices that shaped fashion history." The room erupted in gasps and applause, but Louis held up his hand for quiet. "There's something else," he said, looking at Eleanor with deep gratitude. "Something that explains why this partnership means more than just breaking current barriers." Eleanor pulled out the leather notebook that had belonged to Louis's grandfather. "These are Robert Hamilton's original designs from the 1950s, sketches and patterns that influenced some of Dior's most famous collections." She opened the notebook to show pages of detailed drawings and measurements. "But even more important than these designs are the words Robert wrote in the margins," Eleanor said, her voice growing emotional. "Listen to this note from 1959. I dream of a day when my grandson or great-grandson might walk into this building not as a worker in the shadows, but as a partner in the light." Louis felt tears forming in his eyes as Eleanor continued reading. From his grandfather's notebook, "Fashion has the power to make people feel worthy and beautiful, regardless of where they come from. Someday, I hope my family will be part of making that dream real for everyone." The silence in the room was profound. Several journalists were wiping their own eyes. Bernard Arnault moved to another covered display. "Today, we're not just announcing Lewis Hamilton as our global partner. We're announcing the restoration of historical truth. He unveiled a series of framed photographs and documents showing diverse workers from different decades of Dior's history. These are the hidden contributors to luxury fashion, Bernard said. Seamstresses, pattern makers, designers, and innovators whose work shaped our industry, but whose names were forgotten. The Samuel Roberts Institute will ensure their stories are finally told. Louis stepped forward, holding his grandfather's notebook. This partnership isn't about me being the first Black Formula One driver to work with a luxury brand. It's about me being the third generation of my family to contribute to Dior's success. The only difference is that this time, we're being celebrated instead of hidden. A reporter from The Guardian raised her hand. Louis, how does it feel to learn that your family's connection to fashion goes back so many decades? Louis smiled through his tears. It feels like coming home. Every time people criticized this partnership, saying I didn't belong in luxury fashion, I felt defensive. Now I understand why. Deep down, some part of me always knew this was where I belonged. Eleanor stepped beside him. The business card I gave Anthony Hamilton 17 years ago wasn't random kindness. I had been researching the Hamilton family history for years, waiting for the right moment to reconnect our family's stories. She pulled out one final document, a letter written in faded ink. This is from my grandmother's papers, written in 1945. She wrote, Samuel Roberts has a vision for fashion that goes beyond making beautiful clothes. He believes fashion should elevate the human spirit and give people confidence to achieve their dreams. I hope someday his descendants will be able to fulfill that vision on the grandest stage possible. Louis looked around the room at the faces watching him, journalists, photographers, Dior employees, and fashion industry leaders. My great-grandfather's vision is being fulfilled today, Louis said. Not just through this partnership, but through every young person who will benefit from the Samuel Roberts Institute. Every diverse designer who will finally get the recognition they deserve. Every family whose hidden contributions will be brought into the light. As the press conference concluded and reporters rushed to file their stories, Louis stood in the center of the historic atelier, holding his grandfather's notebook. The 7-year-old boy who had made a promise in the rain at Silverstone could never have imagined this moment. But somehow, across 4 generations and 80 years, that promise had led exactly where it needed to go. The storm that had threatened to destroy Louis's reputation had instead revealed the most beautiful truth of all. He had never been breaking barriers alone. He had always been part of a family legacy of excellence that was finally ready to be celebrated. 3 months later, Louis Hamilton stood in the main hall of the Samuel Roberts Institute for Fashion Heritage in London. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls onto displays showing photographs, sketches, and stories of diverse fashion workers from across 8 decades. But what made him smile most was seeing his father Anthony standing next to a large portrait of his own grandfather Robert, reading the plaque that finally gave him proper credit. "Look at this, son," Anthony said, his voice full of wonder. "It says here that Grandpa Robert helped design the patterns for Dior's 1959 spring collection. I never knew he was so important." Louis joined his father in front of the display. "He was always important, Dad. The world just wasn't ready to see it back then." The Institute's opening day had brought together an amazing mix of people. Fashion students from Central St. Martin's walked alongside elderly seamstresses who had worked for luxury brands in the 1960s. Young designers from Jamaica, Nigeria, and Mexico studied displays next to established fashion editors and industry leaders. "Mr. Hamilton," a young woman approached them nervously. She looked about 22, with beautiful dark skin and eyes that reminded Louis of his sister. "I'm Amara Johnson. I'm starting my fashion degree next month thanks to the scholarship program. I wanted to thank you." Louis shook her hand warmly. "You don't need to thank me, Amara. This institute exists because of what my family and many other families contributed to fashion over the years. You deserve to be here." My grandmother was a seamstress in Birmingham. In the 1970s, Amara continued. She made clothes for wealthy families, but never got to sign her work or get credit. When I told her about this place, she cried happy tears. Anthony squeezed Louis's shoulder. "That's exactly why this matters." Across the room, Eleanor Pemberton sat in a comfortable chair, surrounded by visitors who wanted to hear her stories about the early days of fashion. At 86, she had become something of a celebrity since the press conference. Fashion magazines were calling her the woman who changed everything. Louis walked over to check on her. "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" "I'm wonderful, dear boy," she said with a bright smile. "Do you see that young man over there by the Samuel Roberts display?" Louis looked where she was pointing. A teenage boy was taking notes while looking at his great-grandfather's tools and sketches. "That's Marcus Williams." His great-grandmother was a hat maker who worked with some of the biggest fashion houses in Paris during the 1940s. Her work was never credited either. But now Marcus wants to become a fashion designer, and he knows his family's history. Louis felt his heart swell with pride. This was what the promise had always been about. Not just his own success, but opening doors for others. His phone buzzed with a text from Max Verstappen. "Watching the news about the Institute opening. Proud of you, mate. See you at the next race." Similar messages had been coming in all day from his fellow Formula One drivers, showing their support. The racing world had embraced the story completely once they understood the family history behind it. Sarah Mitchell, Louis's communications director, approached with her tablet showing social media updates. "Louis, you need to see this. The hashtag Fashion Heritage is trending worldwide. People are sharing stories about their own family's hidden contributions to various industries." Louis scrolled through some of the posts. A woman in India had found documents showing her grandfather helped design textiles for major fashion brands in the 1950s. A man in Brazil discovered his grandmother's sketches in luxury shoe company. Archives from the 1960s. Families everywhere were learning about relatives whose talents had been overlooked. "It's bigger than fashion now," Sarah continued. "People are researching hidden histories in architecture, music, technology. Everywhere diverse workers contributed but weren't given credit." Bernard Arnault appeared at Louis's side, looking pleased with the turnout. "Louis, I have some news that I think will make you happy." He handed Louis an official-looking document. "We've received applications for the Samuel Roberts scholarships from 47 countries. Young designers, pattern makers, textile artists, all wanting to study fashion and learn about their heritage." Louis read through the list of countries, amazed by the global response. "This is incredible. There's more," Bernard continued. "Other luxury brands are contacting us about starting similar heritage programs. Chanel wants to research their diverse workers from the early 1900s. Louis Vuitton is looking into hidden contributors to their leather crafting techniques." Anthony joined the conversation, still carrying the program with his grandfather's story. "Does this mean other families might discover their histories too?" "That's exactly what it means," Bernard replied. "Your son's courage in standing up for. This partnership has started something much bigger than any of us imagined." As the day continued, Louis moved through the crowds, talking to students, families, and fashion industry leaders. Each conversation reminded him of why the 7-year-old boy's promise had been so important. Near the end of the afternoon, a familiar figure approached. It was Daniel Thompson, the young journalist from The Guardian who had questioned Louis at the press conference months earlier. "Louis, I wanted to tell you something," Daniel said. "After that press conference, I went home and asked my father more about our family history. I discovered that my great-grandfather wasn't just a bus driver in Birmingham." Louis listened intently. He also worked nights as a leather cutter for a luxury handbag company. He developed techniques they still use today, but his name was never recorded. When I wrote about it in The Guardian last month, the company reached out to learn more about his contributions. Daniel smiled broadly. "They're naming their new workshop after him, the James Thompson Leathercraft Center." Louis felt tears forming in his eyes. "That's beautiful, Daniel. It never would have happened without your story inspiring me to dig deeper into my own family's past." As the sun set over London and the Institute's opening day came to an end, Louis stood with his father and Eleanor looking out at the city lights. "Do you think Grandpa Robert would be proud?" Anthony asked quietly. Louis thought about the worn notebook, the forgotten sketches, the dreams written in the margins by a talented man who never lived to see them fulfilled. "I think he'd be amazed that his dream became bigger than he ever imagined," Louis replied. "Not just his family being recognized, but families all over the world discovering their hidden legacies." Eleanor squeezed both their hands. "The best promises," she said softly, "are the ones that grow beyond what we first imagined when we made them." The 7-year-old boy standing in the rain at Silverstone had promised to use success to help others. Tonight, That promise was helping people across the globe discover their own family's forgotten contributions to history. The storm had passed, and something beautiful had grown in its place. And that was the end of Lewis Hamilton's incredible story, a tale of family legacy, hidden history, and promises that span generations that we'd love to know. Where are you listening from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let us connect with our amazing global community. If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the hidden contributions of diverse families throughout history, please hit that like button to show your support. Your likes help us reach more people who need to hear these important stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell for more inspiring tales that celebrate the unsung heroes who helped build our world. We share stories that matter, stories that spread kindness, awareness, and hope. And here's the most important part. Please share this video with your friends and family. Every share helps spread awareness about the hidden legacies that deserve to be celebrated. Together, we can ensure that stories like the Hamilton families are never forgotten again. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, remember, every family has a story worth telling, and every person deserves to know where they truly belong. See you in the next story.